Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of the Natalie inRenaissance podcast. In the last episode, I discussed the psychological support that performers and creative artists need to be creative, to feel good about what they're doing, and to feel safe in a learning environment. And one of the things that I think in creating this podcast is that there's always an element of performance, there's always an element of being under pressure or being under stress, even if it's eustress, the good kind of stress. There's always some kind of psychological hill or mountain that every one of us has to climb. And the more I thought about the psychological support that performers, educators need to give, we need to talk more and learn more about performing under pressure. And that's something that everyone goes through. And I think if you don't talk about these things, we're never going to learn how to build the mental framework that we need internally, the psychological support in understanding what happens to our bodies, to our minds, and how we can support ourselves through it and also teach others about. Because I think it plays such a big role in the learning and also in performing of any given thing. And someone said, well, where does this pressure come from? And honestly, I think it's just because you care. I think you care so deeply that you are invested in whatever you're doing. You want to do a good job. And so there may be expectations from other people like parents, clients, or colleagues, but really I think it does come down to because our own emotions are involved somehow. And so I wanted to spend some time and talk about performing under pressure today. And I came across a book over the summer that was incredibly helpful. And a good majority of what I'm going to say today comes straight from that book. And so I'll be sharing a lot of quotes. And so the book is by Dr. Ceri Evan, Perform Under Pressure. And he had such a helpful way of thinking about being under pressure, what happens to the body, and also giving us a frame and different ways in that we can support ourselves through this. And by understanding it, we can kind of lift the veil under what pressure is and why it's such a mystery. And in his book, he says that so many people, even talented, skilled people, they suddenly collapse under pressure and no one really seems to understand why. And so he goes back, and the most common thread in the book is that our emotional regulation system sits at the heart of how we perform under pressure. And so one of the first things that he introduces is this idea of the red system and the blue system in the mind. And so the red system is led by the amygdala, which is a part of the brain's limbic system that is responsible for detecting danger and also plays a role in behavior, emotional control, and learning. And so the main job of this amygdala is to regulate emotions, and so it links emotional meaning to our memories, and it is also linked with decision making. And so it pairs certain events like a bad experience. It documents that with very strong emotion because it's primed for survival. And so if the limbic system senses danger, the amygdala will release stress hormones that lead to fight, flight, or fawn. And so this red system is very much responsible for very high emotional reactions. It's very much linked to past experiences. It affects memories. It affects learning. And it's based off of these split-second reactions of raw, unprocessed data. And Evans likens it to an extremely powerful thermostat, and it turns up our energy or it turns down in an instant. And it's not very well linked to actual reality or fact, but it is geared to survival. And so Evans calls this biological system that includes the amygdala, the red, or the feeling system. And so this can be triggered very easily where maybe there's a conversation where you feel like you just get over emotional and you lose control, or something happens and you just get really upset right away, or when you feel triggered. And that's because your amygdala has been activated and you are in your red system. While it is beneficial to have the system, of course, for survival and safety, it is good to know that we do have a countering system as well. And Evans calls this the blue or the thinking system. And this is headed up by the prefrontal cortex, which sits at the front of one's head, and it serves as the control center and it mediates our highest cognitive abilities. And the prefrontal cortex, it allows us to solve problems, set goals, learn, and adapt. And because it's linked more with rational, logical analysis, it has been described as the cool system. And so maybe if you do feel triggered in some way where you're in your red system, the blue system would say, well, maybe they didn't mean it that way, I'm overthinking it, or just pulling you back to more of fact or more reality. And so in the best scenario of emotional regulation, these two things are working together because we can't really control the red system when it is triggered, right? That's a very strong biological feeling mechanism built into each one of us. But the blue system, the quicker it can kick in and be activated to sort of balance it out and say, well, is there danger here, or, something like that, the more we will be in control of our feelings and to not make irrational decisions or thoughts. Dr. Evans notes that the red system handles the raw data first, but then the blue system takes that data and interprets it and says, well, is there a threat here? What's going on? And so his point is that this blue system will always be a secondary system to the red, meaning that biologically we are primed to react to things before we are to actually think about things. And while this is wonderful for survival, for safety, it's not very good for living a balanced life where we don't stress ourselves out even more than we're feeling. There's so many books written about emotions and feelings that very rarely do they correctly and accurately describe the reality in which we live. And when you think about stress and performance, oftentimes we're worried about things that won't even happen. We're conjuring these things in our mind very irrationally that aren't based in fact. And so when the amygdala is activated and when a person is under stress, biologically the amygdala comes to support them. And while the prefrontal cortex is linked to the amygdala and in a neutral situation they work together, but when the amygdala senses danger, it releases these neurochemicals that shift the orchestration of brain responses, and it shuts down neural pathways to the prefrontal cortex. So instead of wasting time on logic, on thinking, on decision making, there's no wasted time and you just react for safety. If this is a very common response in a person where they are constantly reacting, constantly triggered by life, and the amygdala is a pro at shutting down that neural pathway to the prefrontal cortex where no logic, no reasoning will have any effect on this person. Dr. Evans calls this being in red overdrive, which means that our blue system is really helpless when it comes to the red because there is no braking power. And so this is someone who has just lost control of their emotions. Nothing you say can help. You feel like you're totally helpless and there's nothing that you can do to support yourself in this moment of being under stress, which is really not a good feeling at all because that person has to exit the situation or leave in order to calm down the red system in order to come back to a neutral space. And in very common performance situations, say like a public speech, a performance, a review at work, an interview, not everyone has the luxury of exiting those spaces. And so performance can also mean the way one shows up in that moment, in the process of being in those moments. And so being aware of this red system and being aware of this blue system is very useful in just recognizing that the red system, the amygdala, reacting to stimuli, reacting to things that you can't control, that is a normal biological response. And I think sometimes when you encounter the feeling of the butterflies or the nerves, or your mouth is dry, or your heart starts to beat very fast, I could remember this as being nervous and let that trigger me even more, or I could just understand that this is my body biologically priming me for this important event that I care about. And so right there, what I just shared was a form of metacognition. And metacognition is basically an awareness and understanding of one's own thought processes. And what I did is I was able to say, okay, I'm feeling these things, but what does it actually mean? And what reality is it giving to me? Does this nervousness mean that I'm not prepared? Does it mean that I'm not ready? No, it doesn't at all. Our emotions very rarely, as I've said, very rarely do they indicate the true reality of the situation we're in. They're just biological reactions to whatever our limbic system is sensing. And so what I've done there is I've moved from the red system more into the blue system, which keeps my emotions in check, and it keeps me in a very logical, rational space in that I'm still in control of my emotions and my thoughts. I think the beauty of realizing these two systems is that so much of this has to do with self-control. And when we experience things based on stimuli, when we are in a stressful situation, and I'm not even talking about work performance or musical performance, but even in handling relationships, like when we are triggered by a conversation, we need to learn how to move from the red system to the blue system very quickly. And the faster we can do that and exercise that conscious thought in bringing us back to reality, in grounding ourselves in logic, the better our emotional regulation will be. And again, I think I've talked a lot about the power of self-talk, the power of our thoughts, that we can support ourselves just by the mental framework that we do hold and grounding ourselves in logic and not letting our feelings run away into irrational places and then end up believing them, and then that affects our performance, it affects our identity, and it's just a downward spiral from there. So in learning about these systems and understanding the neurological and biological mechanisms at play, we can then be very conscientious in how we choose to counteract that red system. If we know that's how we were designed, if we know that's what's going to happen, having a plan to activate the blue system as quickly as possible needs to be our focal point. And so one of the techniques that Dr. Evans shares is rename, reframe, and reset. If you do feel that your emotions are activated and you do feel all of those biological systems sensing danger, we can rename those things. Instead of saying, I am nervous, and then interpreting that to be, I'm not ready, or I shouldn't be here, just sensing those things and then letting the blue system say, okay, this is my biology coming here to support me. These are all natural biological mechanisms at play. However, I am ready. I have done this. I have supported myself every day. I am ready. I am valued. I am here to share what I'm doing and something I care about. I am so excited for other people to experience this with me. That is reframing the situation. That is sort of resetting the red reaction by giving blue reassurance. And it's exactly those things, our thoughts and our mental models that we have practiced and believe, that make all the difference when it comes to performance, especially musical performance. In my time in studying classical music, I never really learned about how to handle my emotions or these different psychological structures that would come into play as one was performing. And in college, I know that the performance track, of course, was high pressure and lots of different people handled it in different ways. But I think if everyone knew about these systems and also had much more psychological training in how to deal with all of these things, counteracting red systems, blue systems, and practicing positive thoughts, positive thinking, positive mental habit building, I think it would have made such an incredible positive difference for so many people. And now, as an artist and musical educator myself, I recognize that this training is such an important and integral part of anyone who wants to be a performer in any capacity, not only in the musical performance world or the creative visual performing arts, but also in business and across the board in relationships, because the way you handle one thing, the way your red system is handled in a personal conversation, a relationship, it's going to be the same neurological wiring. And the more attention that it's given, the more it will be affected positively across the board. And so this is why I'm talking about this, especially on my podcast, because educating people about their minds, educating people about the power of thought, of consciously choosing their reactions, being very aware of their inner self, it is the biggest building block of performance. And so, of course, as some of my students, when they come to visit, oh, I played this at home and now everything's going to pieces and I don't understand why. In helping them learn about these red and blue systems, they understand, okay, this is what's happening and this is how I can help myself in those moments. And so by talking more about the mind and how important it is, the less scary performance becomes, because it's really not about those outer things you can't control. It really is all about your own mind and how you react internally, how you monitor and regulate your emotions, how you interpret things that are triggering, and the things that you say to yourself and have prepared going into those moments. And recognizing that you, yourself, your soul, you are at the center of all those things is so reassuring, and it makes performing that much more enjoyable because it's not about everything else. It's about you. What you choose to say to yourself, what you choose to focus on, the thoughts that you have in your brain, the thoughts that you tell yourself. It all comes down to cognizant, positive choices that we can help our own self to make in those moments. I hope this was a helpful episode for you. Thank you for listening today. Like and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it today. Follow me on Instagram if you're not already at Natalie inRenaissance. We'll see you in the next episode.